In this video, we're going to take a look at aggregate supply. When we're looking at aggregate supply, we are going to separate the market into the short run versus the long run. So far, we've only had one supply curve when we're looking at individual supply, but for the aggregate supply, we're going to see that it's necessary to have two different supply curves that we're looking at. So to start off with, let's look at the relationship between the price level and the quantity supplied of real GDP. So price level over on this axis and real GDP down here. Now when we're looking at the short run is defined as any time period that is too short for all necessary participants to gather the information and act upon it. So basically, if we are looking at the aggregate supply curve, the reason that we have to separate it into the short run and the long run is when there's a change in the price level, employees, actually consumers and employees, will be affected if wages don't increase. Okay, if the price level starts going up, individuals need to know that there's been an increase in the price level, request a raise, and get the raise in order for us to move from the short run to the long run. And of course, once we get to the long run, then we're basically back in the short run all over again, because again, it's going to be another time period where we don't have enough time to gather all necessary information and act upon it. So basically, in the short run, we're going to see that we have what's called sticky prices and sticky wages. So we'll have sticky prices and sticky wages. So sticky wages and sticky prices, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's going to take some time for firms to adjust their prices, and it's going to take some time for wages to follow the increase in prices. Unfortunately, we see that wages are actually more sticky or stickier. They're more sticky than prices, okay? So prices can be adjusted a little bit easier than wages can. So what does this mean for the supply of real goods and services in the short run? Well, if we look at what's happening with firms in the short run, we'll see that as the price level starts going up, let's say we look at the difference between when the price level is 95 and when the price level is 105. So keeping everything else constant, as the price level starts to increase, what's happening to firm profits in the short run? Okay, so as there's an increase in the price level, what does this mean for the change in profits? Okay, so profits, we know that profits are going to be determined by the price times the quantity. Okay, so this is total revenue minus total cost. Okay, so now if we keep everything constant, like we need to do in the short run, okay, this means that we are not allowing things to change because we want to see ceteris paribus, the relationship. If the price level starts going up, keeping the amount being sold constant and keeping the production costs constant, we see that we start to have an increase in profits. So that means that as the price is going up, it's in a firm's best interest to increase the amount that they're producing. So the supply curve for the aggregate market is an upward sloping curve. Again, this goes back to why are firms in business? Well, firms are in business in order to make money. So that in the short run, we see that the aggregate supply curve is in fact an upward sloping curve. Now, every book and every professor calls this curve something different. So sometimes it's referred to as the short run aggregate supply curve. Sometimes it's referred to as the short run aggregate supply curve. So both of those things mean the exact same thing. Okay. So what we're finding out though is that as the price level goes up, it's in a firm's best interest in the short run to increase their quantity supplied of goods and services. So we'll see that there's an increase in the supplied of all goods and services as the price level goes up. So when we have an increase in the price level, we're going to move along our existing curve to a new spot along that curve. This is not a shift in the aggregate supply curve. So let's take a look at what a shift in the aggregate supply curve would be and what that would result from. So I'm going to just clean this up and I'll relabel that curve. So this is our short run aggregate supply. All right, if we were to look at our individual supply shifts and our aggregate supply shifts, let's see which of these, if any, come over to the aggregate. So there were 5 individual shifts. The first one is when there is a change in the price of inputs or a change in the price of resources. So basically a change in production costs. The second one was when there was a supply side disruption. So this is a disruption to the market. Okay, and it can be anything from when grapes were first growing and we didn't have enough cold nights, or it can be the transportation end where the trucking company was on strike. Okay, so it's any sort of disruption to the supply side of the market. The third change was if there is a change in production technology. The fourth one is the number of firms. And the fifth one is expectations. Okay, so let's see if any of these come over to the aggregate market. If there's an increase in the price of inputs, well, wages are an input. Wages are 70% of production costs. If wages start going up, do we expect that to affect the aggregate supply curve? Sorry, I didn't have aggregate supply over here. I just had individual supply. Do we expect that to have an effect on the aggregate supply curve in the short run? Absolutely. Okay, so this is definitely going to cause a change to the aggregate supply curve. What about if there's a disruption to the market? If we have freight companies that are on strike, is that going to affect the quantity of real GDP that is being provided into the economy? Technology. If we have a technological advancement in the United States, as we increase production technology, we increase our short-run aggregate supply curve. The number of firms. If there are more domestic firms, do we expect there to be more domestic GDP? Absolutely. Expectations. If we think that we are going to war with other nations, we're obviously going to have to increase production in some areas, but what's going to happen to the overall supply of goods and services? Is it going to be affected? Yes, expectations. So all of those things that affect individual markets affect the collective aggregate supply curve in the short run. Okay, so after this, we're going to look at the aggregate supply curve for the long run.